Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, worthy products, and esteemed colleagues. Resolution for the House today is that this House believes that a parliamentary democracy requires the inclusion of sovereign referenda to decide on important issues. We here outside opposition firmly believe that this is the case, and come to you with one burden today. First, that there are flaws in the current, or weaknesses in the current parliamentary democracy system that referenda will help to fix. I'm presenting this to you with the case line, everyone needs a louder voice. Now, before I get into any of our module or a case, I'd like to quickly define some of the terms. First of all, we're going to define a parliamentary democracy as a system of government where there's a parliament elected by the people and the head of state, class executive, is then placed in power as the leader of the winning party. We're going to define sovereign referenda as a general vote by the electorate on a single political question that has then referred to them for direct decision. This is a binding referendum that is embedded in the country's constitution. And we're going to define important issues that have great significance to people's lives, such as bailouts, monetary issues, sectionary issues of war, and give a little depth in the model. Now,
I have a question.
Not this time, thank you. Our model, we're going to say that if 1% of the voting population of the country signs a petition for a referendum on an issue, then the government must call one, similar to what happens in Switzerland. And this result of referendum must be binding, since this part of the referendum is going to be embedded in the Constitution, not this time, thank you. Now, we think that the important issues that will be brought by the referendum are issues that affect the general public's opinion, so significant that they need to be confronted. These are issues that don't need to be voted upon, such as, like I said in the definition, bailout and monetary issues, successionary issues, not this time, thank you, and things like war, whether or not there are war in the country. Now, not this time, thank you. Now, you're going to see three main points come inside of the proposition statement. First of all, you're going to see about how the distance between voters and the legislative executive is too large, and that elected politicians can't represent everyone. Then, my second speaker, Andrew, is going to go on to talk about political engagement. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk to you about today is the distance between voters and legislators / the executive. Right now, both of the most common systems of parliamentary democracy have a weak link between the electorate and representatives, and especially the executive. And what I'm going to show you now is that these problems are evident, and that by introducing sovereign binding referenda, we're actually going to fix these problems. The first system I'd like to go over and is legislative is first past the post. And first past the post, the only person with the most votes wins. So that means what happens here is you have 30% of the population vote if the rest of the vote is split between the parties.
Sorry.
Yes?
But in most of European states, there's proportional democracy, and this solves all the problem. It doesn't mean that you need referendum because there's already the same number of representatives for the proportion of those who voted for a certain idea.
Well, like I said, there are two main kinds in the world, and I am going to be covering proportional representation later in my speech and the flaws sovereign referendum fix within it. Now, we see this is that the majority of the votes don't always go to the winning party in first past the post system. And what this does is it doesn't actually give voter representation. And we feel that what happens in sovereign referenda is it fixes it because there's no two parties, everyone either votes yes or no. There's only direct answers, not this time thing here. It encourages tactical voting in this situation. People not always vote for the parties that they believe in because they think they'll be able to win, and will instead vote for parties that they don't like the least. If you understand what I mean. And this also kills smaller parties because when someone decides to vote for a smaller party, they take the votes away to the parties that they would be voting otherwise, split the vote, and then a different party wins, not always representing, not this time, thank you, the majority of the votes in the country. Now, we also see the first past the post is subject to gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is a division of districts in a way that isn't quite correct. You can change the outcome of a vote by dividing the district in a way that differently represents the population of voters. You could have an area that has 50% voting for one party, and the other party split 25-25. You could change this around so that only 25% was voting, and then the other two were voting as a majority. You can switch the parties around to actually misproportionate and misrepresent the actual votes. Now, referendum doesn't even have the problem of gerrymandering because every place in the country there are no writing, and everyone either votes yes or no. And referendum make these systems stronger because they introduce a direct link between the people and the system that represents them. Now, we see that we also see that in PR there's a large problem too, as they brought up too. Proportional representation, yes, what you do is either voting for an ideal, but the direct link between the people and the executive and the parliament is even less. So what we see in first past the post questions on this time thinking, what you're doing is you're voting for the person who represents you in your riding, who represents you in your riding. in proportional representation, you're voting for the party, which means the party can put in whoever they want into writing. That person doesn't have to be from the area, understand the issues, it can be whoever they feel is most advantageous to their cause. And even worse, a leader of the party is still put into place, so there's no link between the executive either. What we see is this problem is fixed because the referendum has a direct link between the decisions that are made by the executive and the people. Yes?
But why then have parliamentary representative democracy? Why not just have direct democracy? With the help of internet, there are no logistic problems.
What we see is that parliamentary democracy has really good things, and these flaws that we see here can actually be fixed by sovereign referenda. That we don't need to completely change the system, but only implement one thing that really just benefits everyone. The second thing I'd like to talk to you about today is how elected politicians can't represent everyone, and the problems of representation. Even if you get a fair representative member of parliament member of your party in parliament, even PR or first class proposal otherwise, there's definitely issues in the system that prevent them from best representing the interests of their voters. What we see is that they're not always able to represent the needs of their constituency because of things like party lines. In the majority of parliamentary democracies are defined by the parties and party lines, and it's very hard for individual MPs to stray through these party lines without being penalized by the party whip, such as being set in the backbench, which means that the people in their constituency get literally no representation in government. And what we see is that if we introduce a sovereign referendum and not this time thank you, what happens is that despite all these things that disconnect the populace from the executive, what this puts in a direct link when the populace wants and sees that something's wrong, they can say so and not have to wait for another election. Because we see that when you find not this time thank you, what we see is that when you find a problem in the current system, you have to wait for another election. And that can be a long time in different systems, it varies, but still, the damage is most often already done. And what we see is that quite often, referenda solves the problem right away. We don't have to wait for people to break out into protest when the banks fail. We can actually see if these people want to give a bailout to a bank or not. And what we see is that by making this, we give the decision to the people and they don't have to protest, they don't have to make a fuss, and we give them the direct representation that they want in their democracy. And we feel the link between the executive and people is even smaller too. Because in parliamentary democracy, PR or not, what we see is that the executive is actually appointed because it's the head of the party, not directly voted for as in other systems. So what we see that's happening here is the executive isn't picked by the people, and that his decisions and the executive decisions that's made by him or her actually aren't decided by the people as directly as they could be. I feel that sovereign referendum really fixes this the best. Because what happens with sovereign referendum is a simple yes or no vote that decides an issue immediately. It doesn't need any bureaucracy, it doesn't need any problems. What we see is that by doing this, we're giving the vote to people how they actually want these systems, without having to change the system unnecessarily, to produce radical movement, by just adding something that really benefits everyone. And we see it's working in other countries too, like Switzerland, who implemented a similar model to ours, of great success, and it actually has people go out and vote more because this is good. We feel it's a good thing. And we feel that because of this, referendum is a very good thing and that everyone needs a louder voice. Thank you for your time.
Okay, so the first thing I will do in my speech is clarify what a representative democracy and what a direct democracy is. Then I'll proceed to negate and tell them why they plan and what their three burdens, not one, are actually they don't hold up. And then I will present our first argument, which actually directly answers their claims, and it talks about the basis of parliamentary and representative democracy. So what they were presenting as flaws of the parliamentary democracy are actually flaws of representative democracy. Right? It is not a perfect system. However, the alternative to representative democracy is direct democracy, which is exactly what they are trying to propose. They are proposing that the people themselves would govern the state, and the international community and everybody, who can think, basically, agrees that this is not a policy which will work. Let me give you a brief explanation. We don't know how to run a country. That is the first problem. There are a lot of different things, different topics on which we don't know how to vote. let's say I am a plumber. What do I know about a state budget? If I am a plumber, what do I know about foreign policy and complicated diplomatic stuff? And it is not, no thank you, we don't want, first of all, we don't want the plumber to decide on such matters, and second of all, we can't demand from the plumber to make such decisions. What we can demand from the plumber is to find a man who he thinks he can do it, and that is the point of representative democracy. And there's a second reason why we need representative democracy, is exactly the flaw they try to present. Because it is slower to change. Because representative democracy is not an object of populistic speculation, I don't know the word, but basically of fast changes in what the people think. Just because, let me give you an example. For example, there's a shooting in a center, and in I don't know, in a city, right? And there is some sort of racist element involved. For example, there were black people shooting, right? What we need is not a government that will say, oh, black people, let's punish black people, let's be a populistic, impulsive, I'll take you in a second, impulsive, angry mob with stakes and torches and stuff. We need a solid government that will not respond to such claims. Yes?
Are you aware that criminal offenses such as this one actually wouldn't be covered by referenda under our model?
Your model covered a civil proposition of 1% of the government, right? Your first speaker said that we will cover, yes?
Are you aware that we would never, that 1% of the population would never sign a petition demanding that someone be put in jail for shooting?
No, more people will sign that. I'm pretty sure it's very easy to get more than 1% of the Americans to get slavery of black people back. I'm sorry to say this, but that is a fact. You should be aware of it. So let me now move to basically the second point, which they proposed, and shortly negate that as well. They said they were talking about how parties basically influence the representatives and so on. First of all, any decent democracy has a secret form of voting, so it's not obvious who voted on what, which allows representatives to vote against a party's policy without the party basically knowing. That is the first thing here. No, thank you. And the second point is there are very few cases where individuals' morals and individuals' understandings actually differ from a party. That is why he is in that party. So this, no thank you, your policy will bring a lot more problems than it will actually solve. So let me move to our first point of analysis, which will talk about parliamentary democracy and how this policy, as we have established, this way of having democracy, as we have established, a much better way of democratic leadership, is actually undermined by referenda. So, as we have noticed, parliamentary democracy is a representative democracy. The basic idea is that we don't vote on the policies themselves, but we vote on who should decide on these policies. Well, I have already explained why this is a better idea than direct democracy. And what introducing direct democracy, introducing a referendum, and introducing a direct form of democracy will do is we basically undermine this basic principle that this is a representative democracy. And this will do basically on two levels. First of all, it will do it like directly, basically. But policies will be affected by the people. However, even more, because representatives will be basically their decisions, the way they run the country, will be subject to a harsher, if you want, I'm not thinking, a harsher decision by the people. It will also make the whole system a more unstable form of democracy, a form of democracy we do not want. So let me give you another example of how a direct form of democracy undermines the basis of democracy itself. The example is Nazi Germany in the 1930s. What happens there was Hitler won the elections in the basic parliament. But what happens next is the consequence of your policy. Hitler, using a referendum, using a form of direct democracy, changes, yes, I'll take you in a moment, changes the constitution of the state so that he can be chancellor, the prime minister, the executive as you call him, and the president of the state itself. Because of populistic views, because of the way the German people, uneducated, unable to make such a decision, were basically forced and asked about it, because of such a form of direct democracy, the whole point of democracy and democracy itself is not in fact. Yes,
well, don't you think that the idea of someone like Hitler being voted in also kind of it also speaks against representative democracy, which is what you're defending?
Well, first of all, we're both defending parliamentary democracy here, right? That is the first thing you need to remember. The second thing you need to remember is that we are defending a democracy in which Hitler could not have been head of the army, which would be a huge problem for Hitler. The army, no thank you, the army did not like Mr. Hitler, if you want to call it this way. And the army did not like Hitler becoming the president. However, the army is bound by a strong sense of honor and by a strong sense of service. Because this guy was officially, the way the honor goes, was the head of the state, the army was basically forced to follow him and forced to enforce his policies. And there's another thing. If Hitler would not have been allowed to legitimately be the president itself, it would have given the other members of Europe at the time a legitimate reason to intervene, which could have maybe prevented the Second World War. Basically, what we have shown you in my speech until now is that they are not trying to supplement, or an even better word, it is impossible to supplement representative democracy with direct democracy. There is either one or the other. And we think that representative democracy is in any case a better form of democracy because it is a more stable form of democracy, because it is a more safer form of democracy. And that is why I beg you to oppose. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are gathered here today to discuss the issue of introducing sovereign referendum into parliamentary democracy. I, second proposition speaker, will be discussing the issue of political engagement, which we feel is helped by the introduction of referenda into the system. But first, I'd like to begin by rebuilding my partner Ben's points and reviewing some of the points that the opposition has made. Now, to begin with, my partner, the third opposition speaker's POI against Ben was rather flawed. We see that the third opposition speaker pointed to the PR system in an effort to point out, incorrectly so, that our model only applies to first past proposed scenarios. However, Ben clearly dealt with that in the latter part of his speech and explained how it is also necessary in first past proposed scenarios that we hold, PR scenarios, that we hold the referendum. Ben went on to explain how
you basically say, your first speaker comes here and says, it works great in some cases, it doesn't work well in other cases. What is the difference that makes it work in one case and it not work in another case?
We see that sovereign referenda are effective in both systems because under PR, the elected officials are not necessarily representing a person from any one region, because they're taken from another country, whereas someone from first past the post system is just as indirectly elected and just as unrepresentative of the people, because of the reasons that my partner Ben explained. So, now the first opposition pointed to the idea of direct democracy via the internet, and seems to be proposing that we need to use direct democracy in our case. However, he went on to contradict that in his separate argument. Not sure where you're trying to go with that. But anyway, we'd like to take this time to point out that it is in fact very impractical. We need every last decision of the people. and that we are firmly opposed to direct democracy as a whole, because it is simply impractical to ask every last question to people rather than the people that we elect, and that only some decisions can be left to the public, because some are too complex for them to understand. Our model would only have referendum based on issues that A, are simple enough for the public to understand, or B, that have been protested against by 1% of the population. And if 1% of the population is protesting, then clearly a large amount of the population understands the issue. I'll now move on to my rebuttal of the first opposition speaker. The first opposition speaker claimed that we would put direct democracy in place, which is frankly incorrect, as I explained earlier, and basically implied that we would leave even the most complex, inaccessible issues to the public. We would never ask of a random citizen what should be asked of the next vote. This is something that we would like to make clear. He also went on to describe rather strangely that it would be easy to obtain via a referendum slavery in America. No, thank you. Because he seems to think that 1% of Americans would like to see a return of slavery to America. However, we would like to point out that even if you could get 1% of Americans to sign this petition, which we think is highly unlikely, you would have to have more than 50% of Americans approve it in the referendum for it to happen. Yes.
So that means even if it's not going to be passed, you're still going to have a referendum that costs a lot of money, and it is a duty to state in doing. So why would we have to pay such a big amount of money to make this referendum for such a stupid question?
I said already that we think it would be highly unlikely that that particular issue would be brought to light in the referendum. Now, the first opposition speaker also said that our referendums undermine the basis of democracy, and we outside proposition would like to question whether the first opposition speaker understands that the basis of democracy is in fact putting the public in the hands of the public, which is what we are trying to do with this motion. Yes.
You're not putting the hands of the public in the hands of the public. You're putting the hands of the public in the hands of the majority.
The majority of the public, yes. So, now, my point is about political engagement and how referendums improve it. Now, what referendums allow is for both the government to be more in touch with what people want, and for people to be more engaged with the democratic process by expressing their opinions more often and more directly in ways that are not subject to gerrymandering, for example, and other parliamentary systems that they don't benefit. So, first, let's look at how the government could now be more in touch with the people. Now, under today's system, most politicians are not required to hold any referendums at all, and there are years between election periods. This means that a politician can go those years without ever having to answer to what the public wants. And we see that this is one of the most convincing reasons to hold a referendum, because it keeps the government in touch with what people want. Now, we also see that circumstances are constantly changing. One more reason for the government to be constantly up to date. And because often the government is elected based on what the people wanted to, say 2 years ago. We're 2 years into the ruling party's period of election. And now this person has maybe fallen out of favor. And referendums are a way to avoid this by directly asking the people what they want. But again, I stress, only in ways that the public are capable of doing. For example, we're not asking overly complex issues. We would only give them the louder voices that they need on issues that they can understand and that they are passionate about, and that they have expressed their passion about by signing a petition that we've been talking about. Another thing. Currently, Parliament only discusses and passes laws on issues that are raised by the MPs in Parliament. Now, of course, we're talking about the majority of cases, no thank you. The case of Switzerland, upon which our model takes inspiration in perception. No, thank you. The model we've shown you now gives people an easier way to bring issues people think are important to the people. Clearly, if 1% of the population cares about an issue enough to sign this petition, then we think it is important enough for the issue to be brought into a referendum. No, thank you. This represents a more true form of democracy because it holds politicians more accountable. Currently, the Institute for Electoral and Democratic Assistance has also found that the average voter turnout in the two biggest parliamentary systems to be 70% by the two biggest parliamentary systems, I mean PR and post-passive voting. Now, this is a problem because only 70% of people are voting. Introducing referenda gives people a bigger chance to be involved. So when you take the percentage of people who voted in the election and the percentage of people who voted in the referendum, more people have voted in at least one of these things, and you're getting a far more accurate picture of what the public wants. And we're giving you the chance to learn more about democracy, and make more meaningful decisions. No, thank you. For your time. And when people's trust in our government is waning, referendum can counteract the sense of cynicism and powerlessness among voters, because your vote will always count in the event of a referendum and will not be subject to problems like flag or status systems. Also, because voters can see that their decisions are having a real political impact, their confidence in their government will be strengthened, and they will be more likely to vote in elections. They'll be more likely to vote in elections because they feel that the system is not far removed from them. And so you see that everyone needs a louder voice, and that when they receive these voices, democracy triumphs. Thank
you. Ale ja som tam nevidel žiadnu analýzu toho, že ako by sa to stalo. Takže to možno, neviem. Je to úplne zvláštne.
The main reason why we have any political system involved is to get things done. Either by means of direct democracy, by people voting themselves about things, either by representative democracy, by representatives voting on things, but at the end of the day, what we want is something to change. Is the people's will be manifested in some way. And what side proposition has done today is to present us a system which will not only spend huge amounts of money, which will not only lead to absurd results, but will, at the end of the day, actually make the whole system of democratic decision so slow that it will actually stop any form of democracy. But first, to explain this completely in my book, in my later points of negation and my second argument, before that, I'll move on to certain smaller points of negation of what side proposition is focused today. They can basically, one of the basic problems they had right at the beginning, they couldn't understand the whole concept of difference between the representative and the elect. Basically, as the old problem goes, I think they wanted to capitate and equal, and which is unfortunately impossible in this case. You can have a representative democracy in which you vote for people which then do things for you, or you can have a direct democracy, in which people vote about things themselves. If you make people vote about things themselves in a representative democracy, then at this very point, it stops being a representative democracy and it transforms into a form of direct democracy. And hence, it is impossible to simply supplement something without getting community. Now, one of the biggest problems the side proposition had was that they didn't even recognize that democracies should have certain safeguards built into them. So these safeguards should protect people, even if there is a majority of people from voting against things such as rights of minorities, such as human rights, and so forth. And at the end of the day, to protect voters against getting rid of democracy itself. So, for example, they had no trouble about the referendum being signed up on minority rights, such as on slavery of black people in the US, even though most democratic countries would explicitly prohibit something like that, even if the referendum is certain to fail, merely because it would be such a huge absurdity and such a huge violation of human rights, merely by making people decide on it. Joseph.
When you say, though, that a similar result that would happen in the referendum would be portrayed in the next election, but just at a slower rate?
No, sir. No, sir. Firstly, you didn't bring, the point still holds that that these things should not be judged upon. And also, we brought into the point about the difference between a referendum and a parliamentary democracy, which is that in a referendum, you only have two choices, a yes or no choice, whereas in a parliamentary democracy, you have a whole variety of choices, for example, you have a variety of possible representatives that promise to give you, to represent you in a manner of far-left politics, of center-left politics, center-right, far-right, and so forth. Where so you have several possible choices, whereas in a referendum you have only two choices, which actually makes referendums give you a smaller possibility of actual choice on how things should be done. Now, what Science Proposition also talked about is how the problem of representative democracy is that people get elected and then they stop doing anything and just collect the money, and we should be able to get rid of them as soon as possible. We think this is silly because the greatest motivation that people have in the representative democracies is to get elected once again in the next term. And we think that this is quite enough motivation to get them, in the great majority of cases, to work in the will of the people and in the will of the voters. They're still that they won't be failed by the voters at the next election. They also talk about that the system getting more voters into various elections and various referendums. Yet what happens in practice is usually actually the opposite thing. Is when there are referendums held up every month or so, there are less and less voters at every referendum until, for example, to use a Slovenian example, the final result is 30% of people or so, or even less, going to a particular referendum, and very little interest in actual political engagement. Also, another point in which they failed to understand how democracy works presently is when they said that people do not get any other possible form of participation if we exclude referendums. This is not the case, as even in most parliamentary democracies, you have the opportunity of people to give, to present participations to the parliament, and then the parliament decides on whether something that was presented by the people should be upheld or not. So the parliament devotes a particular amount of time every month to decide on things brought up by people themselves. So basically, to sum up all of these things, they keep talking about very small problems that are found in particular representative democracies of today, such as, for example, gerrymandering, which is pretty much found only in North America and in virtually no European country, and hence isn't a real problem in all representative democracies. Or, for example, problems that are found in majority voting systems, which can easily be changed for the much better proportion voting systems. Now, to get to our second argument, which also deals with what will happen if 1% of the people will get to decide which referendums should be signed up, and thus deals with a large amount of what they brought forth. The problem is that people have this tendency, it is a basically psychological tendency, to be unsatisfied with a lot of things, even if these things are extremely necessary. For example, let's look at the austerity measures that are being presented today in most European states. Whereas it is an economic truth, basically, that without these measures, most European countries will eventually go bankrupt if the crisis is to continue. The great majority of people in European states strongly object to these measures because they have in their minds this third option, which is unfeasible, but they have it in their minds, that it is somehow possible to get through the crisis without any decrease in government spending. And they themselves, the proposition themselves, mention bailouts as one of the possible things that could be talked about on referendums. Even though this is such a strong, such a complicated economic policy that it's very hard to imagine that the majority of people would be able to produce competent beliefs on this position. So what will happen in the end is that people will be unsatisfied with the majority of things brought forth by the parliament, and will want to continuously hold referendums on things, even if these things are inevitable, and thus, even if they don't end up rejecting them, what will happen is that still will spend such a large amount of time deciding on virtually everything that is brought up by the executive power that the political process will become so slow that will actually get far less done at the end of the day. And this is the whole point of representative democracy,
getting representatives there instead of the people themselves, so that more things are done, so that we don't have to use all these logistic problems to get the people's will enforced. And thus, because their proposition will create such huge differences, we beg you to oppose the motion.
I keď bude voliť napríklad, keď sme Česko alebo Slovensko do Európskej únie, tak budeme sa odvoliť, že či to chcú. A to je referendum. Proste, že bolo napríklad Švajčiari to skúsili, Švajčiari majú skúsili demokraciu do referenda, napríklad aj o tom, že koľko, aký platí tá politika na referendum.
In this debate today, we've seen an opposition team that is full of contradictions, that wants a safer form of democracy in which the views of the people are constantly ignored, so that the politicians can have an easier way to keep their country stable, instead of listening to the will of the people who want change, who want to bring about change in their country. Whereas you've seen a proposition team that want to improve the current system of government, who understands that unlike opposition says that you have to choose one or the other, you can have both. That you can have some decisions made by a representative government, and the most important decisions, the decisions that impact everyone in everyday lives, made directly by the people, because these are the issues that are most important to them. Today, in my summary speech, I'll be addressing three main themes of clash in this debate: accountability, engagement, and feasibility. And through this, I will show you how proposition has clearly proved its purpose, that there are current problems with the current system of democracy that can be fixed with the inclusion of sovereign referenda. So let's go right into this first idea of accountability. And now, contrary to what side opposition seems to tell you, such as that secret votes, no one can tell who voted for what, and there are very few instances where representative views differ from their parties. Well, we think that this just further proves our point, that representatives' views can't differ from the views of their parties, otherwise they'll be disciplined by a party whip. And so this is why we see that actually not a lot of ideas are being talked about in these parliaments, because these people are so afraid of voicing a dissenting opinion that they just won't do it. And so this is why we see that a lot of the issues that are actually really important to people aren't being represented in Parliament, because these politicians who are elected by the people are just too afraid to bring them up in fear of repercussions. Now, another thing that we seem to be thinking is that referendums would undermine the principle of representative democracy. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the fundamental principle of democracy is that people have a say in the laws that govern their lives. So we really don't see how giving people an even more direct link to the things that the rules that govern their lives is undermining the principle of democracy. Actually, we think it is providing an even more direct form of democracy because of this increased accountability between what the people think and what laws are being put in place. And now, they seem to think that if politicians are subject to the will of the people, that this will make things unstable. Now, first of all, politicians are already subject to the will of the people, but we think that they could be even more subject to the will of the people. And we think that the stability that is seen by countries is actually kind of falsified. Just because people aren't voicing the dissenting opinions in Parliament doesn't mean that these opinions aren't felt by the people. That's why recently we've been seeing so many protests over the things that the governments have been doing. It's because these governments haven't been bringing up these issues, so people have had to take to the streets. People have had to protest in order to get their views heard. Yes?
So we have presented you with three examples of countries where referendums did cause instability. Give me one example where they did not.
Okay, well, in many cases in Switzerland, they've actually had multiple referendums that all the people have supported, and we really haven't seen any detrimental consequences to this. In fact, we've seen that people in Switzerland are extremely happy with their form of democracy. And also, to address the numerous examples that you gave, side opposition to presented an idea that the referendum that Hitler presented wasn't successful. Well, first of all, Hitler is widely considered in our world as a military dictator. This man used force and propaganda to influence the people to vote this particular way. And also, he did not rule with the influence of parliamentary democracy. So we don't see that Hitler is actually a feasible example of a parliamentary democracy with the inclusion of a referenda. And so they also told you that voting yes or no is an indirect choice. And now what we would say is that no, it's absolutely not an indirect choice. It lets the people show the government yes or no. Should we do this or should we not? There's no fair way that the public can express their opinion other than through a referendum. So now that we fully addressed that issue, let's look at the issue of engagement. And now they seem to bring up, they use the example of a plumber. If I'm a plumber, what do I know about foreign policy? Well, first of all, foreign policy isn't actually included in our model, but let's just assume that it was. So even if it was, we have two responses to that. Now, first of all, because this plumber knows that the impacts of his decision will directly impact the laws that are being made, he's going to think to himself, since I can really have an impact on the world, I better read up on this. So actually, as we proved to you in our second speech, this will further motivate people to start learning about the issues in our world, to start learning about why this is important, and to start educating themselves in that way so that they can make a good decision. And our other response is that people will be asked to weigh in on issues that have a broader impact on their lives, as I kind of mentioned in my introduction. We kind of like to clear up that the difference between the issues that we'll have the referenda on and the issues that we won't is that the issues that we're going to have referendums on are huge impact, or huge issues with large impacts that will directly affect everyone in everyday lives. A lot of the examples of issues that they've been bringing up, like criminal offenses and like human rights, this isn't included in our model because we do believe that this doesn't directly affect everyone in everyday lives. So we will rely on our elected representatives to make these kinds of laws. Not at this time. So, and then they also brought up this point that maybe not a lot of percentages of people are going to referenda. Well, again, we have two responses to this. The first one is that these are the percentage of people who really, A, know about the issue and care about this issue. And our second response is that we think that like more information out there, as I mentioned before, and the idea that their decisions will have direct influence will actually encourage more of these people to go out and read up on these issues and go out and vote in these referendums. So lastly, let's address the topic of feasibility. Yes.
So why does this not happen in those countries where they have referendums? Why do people reject economic policies around Europe even though they go to their states?
Well, the thing is that people reject. How do we decide what is good for a state? What is good for a state is what is going to benefit the people in the state. And if the people in the state decide that they don't want these things that the government is proposing, then we think that the will of the people should be represented. We don't think that people are completely oblivious to the issues going on in the world. We think that people have educated themselves, and we think that people should be allowed to make these kinds of decisions that are going to be so important for them. So now that that's dealt with, I will finally move on to my last question about feasibility. Now, they mentioned in the POI that there was no technical issues with having lots of referendums. I distinctly remember this in the very first POI I was around. However, they also mentioned that having sovereign referendums would be very expensive. Now, what we would say is that not only is this a clear contradiction in their case, but we think that whatever short-term expenses would be in a little bit of organization would be far away by the benefits of having the public weigh in with their opinions. We don't think that the government should simply say, okay, the public is not going to be able to have a more direct form of democracy because we don't want to file a couple of papers. We think that that's just absolutely ludicrous. So, ladies and gentlemen, what have I shown you today? Well, what we'd really like to emphasize is that we're not against democracy. We're not against the form of representative democracy. We just think that our form of democracy can be made so much better with the inclusion of a sovereign referenda. When we're dealing with these important, crucial issues that impact so many people's lives in many, many different ways, we don't want things to slip through the cracks the way that they might do in representative democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, one person, one vote. Direct representation. Directly what people want. People need a louder voice. Let's give it to them. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we come from a country called Slovenia, where we had in the year 2010 7 referendums. Apart of that, we also have a lot of numbers that know a lot about international relations. What I'm going to do next is, and firstly, going to analyze what happens in proportional democracy and in first part of the poll system. Secondly, I'm going to talk about inefficiency the system will provide. And thirdly, going to analyze the downsides, they say, come in current systems, but they're not true. So firstly, about proportional democracy in first part of the poll. So what is proportional democracy? In the very logic of proportional democracy is we have a very big amount of people in our country. We would love to represent the views, but the problem is that we cannot put every single one in a simple chamber and tell them to talk to each other. We say like to make it more successful and more efficient. We say that parties are from like professionals that know about their subject and can make good choices. They say that that this is not true. They say that this doesn't work because people don't decide what people are going to be in these parties. And this is their only critique. We say that these parties try to be as popular as possible because they want to spread the views. We say that because of that, they're going to put people that actually represent the views of the people. However, we say that they're actually going to put people that do not only represent the views, but have some kind of professional education. They're very clever people that can actually make good and informed choices. What about first past the post system? We think that first past the post system is not a really subject of this debate. Why? We think that the problem with the first past the post system is that actually there's in the parliament there's not representative number of people. But if there's a referendum, there's a representative amount of votes. We see that the two systems logically are not coherent. We don't know why we should debate about it. We say this debate is about proportional democracy only, where actually the number of people that are in the chamber of a parliament applies. So the second point I would like to make is about the inefficiency. Because they said, well, you can have 1% of people that make a referendum. We think that this can raise questions, or we mentioned, for example, questions like slavery. We said that if actually this would come to be true, we are first of all wasting a big amount of money. And we think if there's 1%, actually a lot of things a lot of people can do this. And a lot of referendums will also get that. So we're losing a lot of money. It means money cannot be spent on other initiatives of the government. But we say it is also going to come to very useless questions. Because if you actually have 1% of people, that means, for example, in certain countries, this means extremely small amount of people. So thank you. We say that, for example, in Estonia or Lithuania, the number of Nazis is bigger than 1%. We say it's questions like go fundamentally against human rights and the racism of money. We think that such questions should never be a part of democracy. We ask you why we don't do that. No, thank you. We think that furthermore, we think the problem is why they are inefficient. Is because you have so many. Because when you actually have 1% of people, you can raise questions on everything. Like nuclear power, you can raise them on questions like army or other things. We think that there's going to be a big amount of referendum. For example, in Slovenia, where actually 4% have to sign petition to do this. In year 2010, there were 7 referendums. So we see there are going to be a lot, but in their system, even more. What is the problem when it comes to this? It comes that people, because there are so many referendums, are not attentive to them, because they don't think they're genuinely important. That means that in each and every single of these 7 referendums, the attendance of the referendums was from 15 to 25% of the population. When it comes to that, we say that referendums are fundamentally undemocratic, because if such a small minority, because others are not interested, to come to the referendum, they have this power to decide. We say that because such a small percentage actually votes, no thank you, it is not going to reflect the views of the entire population. We see that when there's elections for a parliament, much bigger amount of people come, and we say that they give their representatives their next 4 years to represent them. So we see that if you do this, it is going to be fundamentally undemocratic. And thirdly, to talk about what are the actual downsides and benefits of our system and what are the downsides of theirs. We say that it is very, very sad that in their case, and there's a lot of countries where they already have a lot of referendums, they have not found any example. We have asked you in our speech, give us please at least one example. And what they have said, they refer to Switzerland. And we think that Switzerland is a perfect example where referendum should not be put in place. Why? We see that in year 2009 there was a referendum in Switzerland about mosques. Because the people, there's a percentage of people that are fundamentally biased and racist in their views. Those people can't undermine the referendum. The minority of the mosque should be removed. So in Switzerland, now because this referendum was then passed with a percentage a little bigger than 50, we say that this means that actually we actually went to make a decision about certain rights that we think are not in our nature. We say that it's fundamental human right to get certainty. And we have so many referendums, we think that certain questions go against certain rights that people have. And we think this is very bad. Furthermore, we think that we think that politicians are the much better ones to raise these questions. Yes.
Don't you think that issues concerning human rights deserve, especially, to be talked about and debated about and made more accessible to the people?
Yes, exactly. But not when we go against those most fundamental human rights. This is fundamentally wrong. So we say like professionals, that means professional politicians are much better. Why? Because we think those are people, they're like professionals on the field. We see that like they are educated, they are good speakers that can deal with the ideas of economy, they can deal with ideas of international relations. We say that not every single person in the country has these capabilities. But we say that in our system, when it comes to regular elections, they can see they have various parties in which these people are. So they decide, well, we are going to trust this person because he knows a lot, but I have a lot of these people that I can trust. So I'm going to trust somebody that is a professional in his field and that I believe his opinion. But not in a referendum, because in a referendum everyone can decide. We think that some people personally cannot analyze the difficulties of the question. We think that politicians deal with this closely. We pay them to work on this profession. We deal with these questions 10 hours a day, and we think they know much more about it. We have shown that they have a lot of problems in their system. It's not going to be more democratic, as they say, but less democratic, because people are not going to care if they're used as questions. On the other side, we show that the current system works very well, and this is why we are incredibly proud to support this. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to compare Side's proposition today with the painting. It's very cute, but it just doesn't fly. What their side has basically proposed, this entire debate, is this wishful thinking about how everybody is just as viable to talk about complicated state affairs, and this wishful thinking that this very easy to abuse system will not be abused, and that this very hard to implement and very slow system will somehow not be slow. And there you see basically an example of the three burdens a proposition has to do, and these three burdens were basically the main point of the debate. The first burden of a proposition is to present a problem. What they have done is basically said, we can all see that there is a problem in today's democracy. They have not presented an example, a problem which we need to solve. They have only assumed that just because that politicians don't act the way the people want. They have only assumed there is a problem in the way a parliamentary democracies work nowadays, have not presented as a valid example of this, and yet still made this claim. So, on what do they fly? The second burden that a proposition has to prove is the burden to prove that their policy will actually be a better policy and solve this problem. Have they done this? Have they solved this fictional problem? Now, they might have solved a fictional problem they have. However, their policy as a whole is a lot worse, because their policy of a whole gives us a direct democracy. Now they can say how many times they want, and I have said this, and my second speaker has said it. They can say how many times they want, they don't only want to change, to fix the problems we currently have in a parliamentary democracy. But the problem they were talking about is an essential part of representative democracy. The problem they were referring to is that the people don't actually vote. And this people don't actually vote is not just a small problem, as presented by me and the second speaker, of parliamentary democracy. It is the essential part and the reason why we have it. Therefore, you cannot have both things at the same time if one thing attacks the essential. So, if you have not proved why your plan will actually improve parliamentary democracy, on what do you plan? And the third burden they have, this burden that the effects of this your policy will actually be better and will not be worse than what we have in the status quo. And what they have left completely unanswered is the problem that if such an easy system to do, a 1% vote, I don't know if cyber position realizes how easy it is to get a 1% of population of a country, will not result in 732 referendums every day, every year. And the next thing, what they were continuously heard to say here is that, well, but we wouldn't actually allow these kinds of referendum. However, again, failing to present an example, what we are actually talking about. What kind of things would be allowed, what not. And the problem with this, and I know why they did not talk about it, because it is a very hard question to answer. If we could answer this question, I think we would not have parliamentary democracy. So if you can prove us that the effect of your policy will be better than the status quo, on what do you apply? So on one side, we have wishful thinking, supported by nothing, and on the other side, you have valid argumentation, supported by many, many examples. And that's why I ask you to throw side of proposition into water where they can swim and let us fly. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, honorable judges, worthy opponents, and esteemed colleagues. Today I have the pleasure of closing off the debate for the day. To do that, I'd like to boil this debate down to three main questions. What is the place of citizens in government? Can governments represent their citizens? And finally, will referenda be introducing government to be effective? Now, what we've seen, as far as the first question goes, the place of citizens in government, we've seen that side opposition seems to tell you that the citizen's place is to tell someone else to do it for them. And we've seen a much more realistic side proposition who has shown you how citizens need to have the direct effect. And we've got examples such as the protests that are happening all around the world for the austerity measures. The austerity measures mentioned by side opposition has a detrimental effect, as the lack thereof of austerity measures or bad effects of referendums as will be implemented. Yet we see that, as our first speaker brought up in the speech, that these not being implemented are still being protested even when not referendums being held. And these protests have the same effects as referendum, just much more damage and disruption in the public system. We feel the referendum gets this done much, much quicker. So they also said that people won't be able to make a decision because Joe the plumber living in Slovenia doesn't understand the politics necessary to decide his country's foreign policy. Yet we see that when you give people this big of a factor in the foreign policy and in the decisions, what they do, as was brought up in our case, that they actually have more of an incentive to figure out what they need to know in order to make an informed decision and help them with their country. Because no one wants their country to do worse off. Everyone wants their country to be better. And when people want that, what we see is they're more likely to try that, and they're more likely to do research, as you said, and more likely to try and understand this issue so that they can make an informed opinion, and that actually these opinions that we're getting actually are the correct opinions. Now, as far as the second question goes, can the government represent the citizens the best? We said that currently there are flaws in the current system. Currently, the link between the electorate and the executive and the House isn't actually strong enough. And we said that because of things like proportional representation and the first past the post, they're not actually choosing their executive, and they're not, and the actual members of parliament can't exactly voice their direct opinions due to things like party whips. Now, that opposition said that this is okay, that this is fine to have. It doesn't. Because they say this is still doing well, and the governments are still doing a better job. And we see, as he brought up examples such as the Wall Street crash, we see that this is happening And that because things that comes that the government actually are making the best decisions, and that people need to be asked about things like this, and that these issues need to be brought to the forefront. And we see that when people are asked, we get a better result. Because they say we're not fixing the problems. They've asked us in their closing speech to understand how we fix the problems that we brought into society. And we see that this lack of a link between the electorate and the executive is actually fixed when you actually give people a direct link in what the electorate does, and the electorate a direct say in what the executive does. So when the electorate designates and approves what the executive does, we're actually giving them the most direct link and fixing the problems that we brought up after our representation. So actually, yes, we did do that. Now, the third point is, will referendums be effective? Like, do enough people come out and vote to choose? And we said yes. If more people care about it, shoot, and more people think that they have a difference, they will come out and shoot, and they will. It will make a difference. And we also said that 1% of the population needs to actually bring forth an issue, and that we feel that this is going to bring more issues to the forefront. Now, side opposition tried to tell you that 1% is a very, very small number, which it seems small. 1 isn't exactly a large number, but 1% of a country of millions is a very large amount. 1% of America is 350,000 people. That's quite a large number of people. And we feel that even if 1% of people still approve this motion, over 50% of the population still has to approve it. So even if 1% passes something ridiculous and asks it to be put into play, it's actually not going to be passed by the majority of 50%. So we did that to stand out. And because of this, we'll say, yes, we are cute, but at least our feet are firmly planted on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, you guys can shake hands.